The courtroom was silent, thick with tension, as the woman stood on one side of the room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Across from her, the man she had dragged into court sat with an unreadable expression, his hands folded in his lap. The judge flipped through the case file, glancing up now and then, trying to piece everything together. No one expected this case to make waves. On the surface, it seemed simple, another child support dispute. The woman claimed the man was the father of her child, that he had abandoned his responsibility. And now she wanted him to pay up. She spoke with confidence, her voice steady, recounting how he had been absent, how she had struggled alone. She insisted he was the father, and there was no way he could deny it. But as the judge listened, something wasn't adding up. The man, despite all the accusations, didn't look angry. He didn't argue. He didn't even flinch. He simply sat there, watching, waiting. And then, when it was finally his turn to speak, he said something that sent a ripple of shock through the entire courtroom. "I don't know this woman," he said, his voice firm but calm. "I have never seen her before in my life." The courtroom erupted. Murmurs spread through the audience, the tension growing thicker by the second. The judge banged the gavel, calling for order, but the shock was already settling in. The woman's face twisted with disbelief, her hands balling into fists. "Are you kidding me?" she snapped. "You're seriously gonna sit here and lie like that?" The man didn't blink. "I'm not lying." The judge sighed and leaned forward. "We're going to get to the bottom of this. We'll settle this with a DNA test." A quiet fell over the room, but the look on the man's face didn't change. He nodded, as if he had been expecting it all along. The woman, however, seemed less certain now. She swallowed hard, her confidence wavering for the first time. And that's when people started wondering, what was she afraid of? Days later, when the test results came in, no one in that courtroom was prepared for what they revealed. The truth wasn't just unexpected, it changed everything. But before we get into that, let's rewind and take a closer look at how this all started. A heavy silence hung over the courtroom as the judge set the DNA test request in motion. The woman stood stiffly, her fingers gripping the edge of the table as if steadying herself. The man, on the other hand, remained composed, his expression unreadable. No one knew what to make of this situation. On paper, it seemed like a straightforward case, a woman seeking child support from the father of her child. But the way the man had denied even knowing her, that threw everything into question. People in the courtroom exchanged glances, some whispering to each other, trying to make sense of it. Was he lying? Was she? Or was there something much deeper going on here? As they waited for the test results, the story of how this woman ended up in that courtroom started to unfold. She was a single mother, doing her best to raise a young child on her own. Life hadn't been easy for her. She spoke about the late nights, the exhaustion, the way she had to juggle work, and parenting without much help. She had always believed that the man sitting across from her was responsible for this child, and she was convinced he had simply chosen to walk away. "I just want what's fair," she had said earlier, her voice firm but not unkind. "I'm not asking for anything more than what my child deserves." And that was the thing. People wanted to believe her. They wanted to believe she was telling the truth, that she was fighting for justice. But there was one big problem. The man had no recollection of her. It wasn't just that he denied being the father. He denied ever meeting her, ever having a relationship with her. And he wasn't defensive about it. He wasn't angry. He was just confused. "I don't know what's happening here," he had said at one point, his voice steady. "But I know this much. I don't have a child with this woman." The judge had watched them both carefully, trying to read between the lines. The woman was emotional, almost desperate, while the man remained calm, almost eerily so. Something wasn't right. As the waiting period for the DNA results dragged on, people in the courtroom began speculating. Some thought the man was just another guy trying to dodge responsibility. Others wondered if the woman had made a mistake, if maybe she had confused him with someone else. But then there were those who felt like there was something bigger at play, something no one had figured out yet. The woman's friends stood by her, whispering words of support, telling her she was doing the right thing. But every so often, doubt flickered across her face, like she was questioning things herself. And the man. He didn't have anyone in the courtroom with him. He was alone, sitting quietly, waiting for the truth to come out. Days passed, and then the results came in. The courtroom was packed when the judge prepared to reveal the findings. Everyone was on edge. The woman sat forward in her chair, her hands clasped tightly together. The man stayed as he had always been, still, quiet, watching. The judge cleared his throat, looking at the document in front of him. He glanced up, eyes scanning the faces in the room. And when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made the air feel even heavier. "The results are in," he said slowly, "and what they reveal is unexpected." A murmur rippled through the room. The woman's face paled. The man's jaw tightened ever so slightly. And just like that, everything they thought they knew was about to be turned upside down. The judge's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and foreboding. The woman gripped the arm of her chair, her knuckles turning white, while the man stayed still, his face unreadable. The entire courtroom was frozen in place, waiting. The judge took a slow breath, his eyes scanning both of them before looking back at the paper in his hands. "The DNA test confirms that." He paused, glancing up again as if unsure of how to continue. The suspense was unbearable. People in the audience leaned in, whispering among themselves, trying to guess what was coming next. The woman swallowed hard. Her confidence, which had seemed so unshakable at the beginning of the trial, was slipping away. Her eyes darted toward the man, as if searching his face for some kind of reaction. But he gave her nothing. No anger, no relief, just that same calm expression. The judge finally spoke again, his voice measured. "This man is not the father of your child." Gasps filled the room. The woman's breath hitched, her hands clenching. Her mouth opened as if to protest, but no words came out. The man remained still. He didn't react the way some might have expected. He didn't jump up in victory or throw accusations her way. Instead, he simply nodded, as if he had known all along. But his eyes darkened slightly, as if something deeper was at play here. The judge adjusted his glasses and studied the woman. "Would you like to explain yourself?" His tone wasn't harsh, but it carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. The woman shook her head quickly. "No, that can't be right," she stammered. "There has to be a mistake." The judge sighed. "The results are conclusive. There is no biological relation between this man and your child." The tension in the room shifted. The whispers grew louder, spreading like wildfire. Some people looked at the woman with sympathy. Others weren't as forgiving. She shook her head again, this time more forcefully. "This has to be wrong. I know he's the father." The man finally spoke, his voice steady. "I told you. I don't know you." The woman's chest rose and fell quickly, her breathing uneven. She looked around the room as if hoping someone would back her up. Her friends, who had been so sure before, now exchanged uncertain glances. The judge's voice cut through the noise. "I will remind you that making false claims in court is a serious matter." For the first time, the woman seemed truly afraid. The man turned slightly toward her, his eyes sharp but not cruel. "Why did you do this?" His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried through the room. She didn't answer right away. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Then something changed in her expression. It wasn't just panic anymore. It was something deeper, something almost like regret. But she didn't speak. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Miss, if there's something you need to tell this court, now is the time." The woman exhaled shakily. For a moment, she seemed to be considering her next move, weighing her options. Then she looked down at her hands, silent. The man's gaze didn't waver. His patience was unnerving, like he was waiting for something he already knew was coming. The judge glanced between them before speaking again. "I'm going to ask you once more. Do you have anything to say?" The woman hesitated, and in that brief pause, something in the air shifted again. Because what she was about to reveal would change everything. The silence in the courtroom felt like it stretched on forever. The woman's fingers trembled as she clasped her hands together, staring down at them, as if the answers were written in her palms. The weight of everyone's eyes on her was suffocating. She could feel the judgment, the disbelief, the curiosity. But most of all, she could feel the man's stare, steady, unwavering, waiting. The judge sighed, his patience thinning. "Miss, I need an answer." The woman swallowed hard, then finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought he was the father." A murmur rippled through the room. It wasn't the confession people were expecting. Some scoffed, others shook their heads. But the man didn't react. He simply blinked, as if absorbing her words. The judge frowned. "You thought." He repeated the word slowly, his tone sharp. "That's not what you said when you filed this case. You were certain. You swore under oath." The woman squeezed her eyes shut for a brief moment before opening them again. There was something different in her expression now. Fear, yes, but something else too. Something almost like guilt. "I was sure," she said, voice breaking slightly. "I had to be sure." The judge's gaze hardened. "Explain." The woman hesitated again, but now there was no going back. She took a deep breath, her voice shaking as she spoke. "I didn't lie. I believed he was the father because—" She stopped, pressing her lips together. Her eyes flickered toward the man. "Because someone told me he was." A sharp, collective inhale filled the room. The judge's brow furrowed. "Someone told you." The man's expression finally shifted. It was subtle, just a narrowing of his eyes, but it was the first real reaction he had shown. "Who?" he asked. His voice was calm, but there was something dangerous underneath it. The woman hesitated. She glanced around, as if checking who was watching. Then she took another shaky breath. "My ex." The tension in the room grew thick, almost suffocating. The judge leaned back in his chair, processing. "Your ex told you this man was the father of your child." The woman nodded, her fingers gripping the edge of the table, as though she needed something solid to hold on to. "I didn't know what to believe at first. But my ex, he was so sure. He said he had proof." He said. She trailed off, her voice cracking slightly. "He said I needed to take this man to court. That I deserved child support. That I shouldn't let him walk away from his responsibility." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, the story twisting in a direction no one had expected. The man clenched his jaw, exhaling slowly, as if he was starting to piece something together. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Where is this ex of yours now?" The woman swallowed hard. I don't know. He left. Months ago." The man finally spoke again, his voice low and deliberate. "Why would he do that? Why would he tell you I was the father?" The woman looked down, ashamed. "I don't know. I didn't ask questions. I was desperate. I needed help." The courtroom buzzed with speculation. People whispered their own theories, trying to make sense of the situation. The judge sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Let me get this straight. You took this man to court, claiming he was the father, not because you knew for sure, but because your ex convinced you." The woman nodded miserably. The judge turned to the man. "And you have never met this woman before?" The man shook his head. "Never." For a brief moment, the woman looked like she wanted to argue, but she didn't. Instead, her shoulders slumped. Maybe, deep down, she already knew the truth before the test even confirmed it. Then, just as the weight of everything started sinking in, the man leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharp. "What proof did your ex claim to have?" The woman's breath caught. "What?" You said he told you he had proof. What was it? The woman shook her head. He never showed me anything. He just said things. That you were lying. That you had abandoned me. That you were trying to disappear to avoid responsibility. The man's eyes darkened. And you believed him. The woman winced. I didn't know what to believe, she admitted. He was so convincing. And I was scared. I was alone. I needed to believe it. The judge sighed heavily, rubbing his temple. This is a mess. The woman seemed to shrink under the weight of his words, but the man wasn't done. He sat forward, his voice firm. Your ex. What was his name? The woman looked up sharply. For the first time, a flicker of panic crossed her face. Why? Because, the man said slowly, I have a feeling this wasn't a mistake. The room fell silent. The woman hesitated, biting her lip. But finally, in barely more than a whisper, she said his name. And the moment she did, the man's expression changed. It was only for a second, just a flicker of realization, but it was enough. Because now, this wasn't just a case of mistaken identity. This was something much, much bigger. The name hung in the air for a moment before the man spoke again. I knew it. His voice was calm, but the weight of his words hit hard. The woman's eyes widened. What do you mean? The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the judge, who was now leaning forward, intrigued by the sudden change in the atmosphere. The room had gone completely still, all eyes trained on the two of them. Who is he? The judge asked, his voice steady but laced with curiosity. The woman hesitated, clearly struggling with something she hadn't fully understood herself until now. His name is. She swallowed hard, her lips trembling. It's Marcus. Marcus James. The name hit the man like a lightning strike. His face twisted in something between disbelief and recognition. Marcus James, he muttered under his breath, his eyes flashing as if a memory had been triggered. Who is Marcus James to you? The judge asked, his voice heavy. The man leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face with his hands. He's not just some random guy. Marcus, he's my brother. A shocked gasp swept through the courtroom. The woman's face drained of color. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. The realization hung in the air like an impending storm. The man continued, his voice now tinged with anger. He's my half-brother, and he's been lying to you, hasn't he? The woman's head jerked up. What? She shook her head, her mind spinning. That doesn't make sense. You. I was adopted. The man interrupted, his tone sharp. Marcus and I share the same father, but we never grew up together. He's been trying to get to me for years. His eyes locked onto hers. You're just a pawn in his game. The woman stood frozen, her eyes wide with disbelief. But why would he do this? Why would he make me believe you were the father? The man's jaw clenched, and he glanced away, frustration clear in his features. Marcus always resented me for the things our father gave me. He wanted to get back at me, to tear me down. He turned back to her. And you. You were just collateral damage in his scheme. The woman's knees buckled slightly, and she stumbled back, almost as if the ground beneath her had shifted. She had been used. She had been manipulated by someone she had trusted, someone she had never suspected would go so far. Her voice came out in a hoarse whisper. I didn't know. I didn't know he was doing that. The judge cleared his throat, bringing the room's focus back to him. I think we've all heard enough for today. His tone was firm but controlled. Miss, I will advise you to consider your next steps very carefully. You've made a serious accusation based on information that, it seems, was deliberately falsified. The woman's face crumpled in shame. Her hands shook as she looked down at the table. I thought I was doing the right thing, she whispered, almost to herself. The judge nodded, his expression softening. Mistakes happen, but there will be consequences for this. But before anyone could respond, the doors to the courtroom suddenly swung open. A man stepped in, looking out of breath, his eyes darting around the room. He was tall, older, and clearly upset. His presence filled the space with a tense energy. Everyone turned to look at him, startled by the interruption. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice cutting through the silence. "I need to speak." The woman's face went pale as she looked at him, then back at the man sitting across from her. What are you doing here?" The new arrival stepped forward, his eyes locking with the woman's. "I'm Marcus James's father." The revelation hit like a bombshell. The room went completely still. The man, the brother of the man the woman had been accusing, was now standing in the courtroom, confirming something that no one could have anticipated. The judge looked at the man, surprised. "And what exactly is your role in all this?" The man took a deep breath. "I came here to tell you the truth." His voice was heavy with regret. "I never wanted any of this to happen." The woman's confusion deepened. "What do you mean? What truth?" The man's shoulders slumped, and his eyes softened with an almost painful sadness. "You've been used," he said gently, "by my son." Everyone in the room stared at him, waiting for him to continue. Marcus's father slowly shook his head. "Marcus has been trying to destroy the relationship I had with my son's mother for years. He's been using women, causing chaos, creating lies. He's done this before. And now you're a part of his twisted game." The woman blinked, not fully understanding what he was saying. "But why? Why would he do this to me?" "Because he knew you were vulnerable," Marcus's father said. "He knew you were desperate for answers, for support. And he used that. He made you believe things that weren't true." The room fell into another long silence. The woman, now overwhelmed with the magnitude of everything she had been dragged into, finally slumped in her chair, her body exhausted by the weight of it all. But just as the tension seemed to settle, there was a sudden gasp from the back of the courtroom. Everyone turned to see the door swing open again. Another figure entered, someone no one had expected to see. It was Marcus. He stood at the threshold, his eyes filled with malice and anger. He looked at his father, his half-brother, and the woman with a twisted smile on his face. "You think you've won." Marcus's voice was low, cold, filled with venom. "You have no idea what's coming next." Marcus stood in the doorway, his eyes cold and calculating, as he took in the chaos around him. His sudden arrival felt like the final piece of a puzzle that no one had expected to fit. The woman, still reeling from the shock of everything, looked up at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice breaking. The man who had claimed to be her father's rival, who had been manipulating her life for reasons she couldn't comprehend, now stood before her with that same arrogant smile plastered across his face. "You think you've outsmarted me," Marcus sneered, stepping further into the room. "You've all played right into my hands. I told you it was just a game." The room fell silent again. The air felt thick with tension, the kind that had been building since the first moment the woman had walked into the courtroom. She felt her stomach churn, a sense of dread settling deep inside her. Marcus's father, who had only moments ago been speaking with sincerity, now looked at his son with deep disappointment. "Marcus, this needs to stop." His voice was firm, the weariness clear in his tone. "You've hurt so many people already. It's enough." But Marcus wasn't listening. His eyes flickered to the woman, his lips curling into something almost like a smirk. "She was always so easy to control," he muttered under his breath, too quietly for the judge to hear. She stared at him, trying to make sense of his words. The man standing before her was so different from the man she had imagined. He wasn't a stranger, but someone who had been manipulating her emotions all along. It was a painful realization, one that she hadn't been ready for. The judge's voice cut through the tension. "Enough." His command rang out, powerful and assertive. He stood, his gaze never leaving Marcus. "You've caused enough chaos here today. I'm putting an end to this." Marcus seemed unfazed. He didn't back down, didn't show any sign of remorse. Instead, his eyes shifted between the woman, his father, and the courtroom, sizing them all up like pieces in his game. "Do you really think you can control everything, Marcus?" The judge continued. "This is over. You're going to face the consequences for what you've done." Marcus's smirk faded slightly, but only for a moment. He stood tall, his hands clenched at his sides, but in that moment, a small part of him began to realize that his schemes were unraveling faster than he had anticipated. The woman, still recovering from the shock of everything, finally found her voice. "You used me," she said, her words coming out with a trembling fury. "All of this, everything, was a lie." Marcus's gaze flickered, but he didn't say anything. He just stood there, watching her. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but it certainly wasn't this. The man who had tried to break her, who had made her feel like she was fighting for something that was never truly hers, was now standing in front of her, devoid of any empathy. "I was desperate," she said, her voice growing stronger. "And you took advantage of that." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "That's the way the world works, sweetheart. People like you are easy targets." Her heart raced as the truth sunk in. She wasn't just a victim of a false accusation. She had been a pawn in a much larger game, one she hadn't even understood until now. But there was something in her, something she hadn't known was there, that had snapped into place. She wasn't going to let this man win. Not anymore. "I'm done," she said, her voice steady and firm. She stood up, taking a step toward Marcus, but not in anger. There was no fear left in her. "You won. You played me. But I'm done playing your games." For the first time, Marcus seemed to hesitate. He looked at her, eyes flickering between confusion and annoyance. But he couldn't intimidate her anymore. The judge turned to the woman, nodding. "I believe you've said enough." He looked at Marcus, his expression no longer one of tolerance. "I'll be reporting this incident to the authorities. You've manipulated people's lives for far too long." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus, still defiant, now understood the weight of what he had done. The game had come to an end. The woman felt a strange sense of release, as if she had been carrying a weight she hadn't known was there. It wasn't over. There would be consequences, and she would need time to rebuild. But for the first time in a long while, she felt in control of her own life. As Marcus turned and began to leave the courtroom, his father's gaze followed him with a mixture of sadness and disappointment. "I tried," Marcus's father muttered under his breath, more to himself than to anyone else. "I really tried." The woman stood, watching the back of Marcus as he walked away, and for the first time, she didn't feel angry. There was only a quiet strength that filled her, a knowing that she had taken back control of her own future. The judge gave a final nod before turning to the woman. "You've been through a lot today, but I think it's time for you to move on from this chapter." She nodded, her heart still racing, but there was peace in her now. It wasn't going to be easy, and the road ahead was uncertain. But at least now, she knew who she was, no longer a victim, but a survivor. The room began to empty, the noise of the crowd fading as the woman made her way toward the door. She had a long road ahead of her, but she was ready for whatever came next. The truth had finally come to light, and she would no longer be anyone's pawn. As the door clicked shut behind her, the weight of the moment lifted. She had faced the storm, and she was still standing.